The United States was surprised, shocked, and angered by the surprise attack upon Pearl Harbor by the Japanese Imperial forces on the infamous day 7 December 1941.
A date which will live in infamy.
The nation had long avoided direct involvement in the war by supporting the efforts of her European friends, but was now drawn to an inevitable conclusion. She would have to fight. While much of the literature and history of the war has been captured in political terms, for instance, a diplomatic failure, military supremacy, democracy versus fascism and National Socialism, other categories of institutions may be identified as having influenced the United States during the conduct and the aftermath of World War II. For the next few minutes, we will look into some common themes or elements of two significant decisions that have been characterized as being wrong or shameful to the extent that the lessons learned from them should prevent such from ever being repeated. These events are the internment of Japanese Americans and the Holocaust. In both cases, the questions have been asked, how could such have happened, and why did anyone let this happen? In the case of the Japanese Americans, we may return to a time before the attack on Pearl Harbor, to a time near the beginning of the last century. Ethnic mistrust, perhaps some have said, a legacy carried over from the exploits of Genghis Khan, brought about a common sentiment of xenophobia, a term translated from the Greek to mean fear of foreigners. Such was the sentiment that even legislative action was taken to intentionally limit immigration by people from the Orient, thus short-circuiting opportunities in the areas of education and economic prosperity for them. This institutional discrimination was to lead eventually to the dehumanizing treatment of the Japanese Americans by the United States government. This characteristic of xenophobia that leads to dehumanization was also progressing through the ranks of the National Socialist Party leaders of Germany, led by its chief proponent, Adolf Hitler. He too had propagated ideology through the publication of his book, Mein Kampf, or in English, My Struggle. The twisted logic he eventually put into practice was to blame all that was wrong with the world, not sparing any institution, was the fault of the Jewish people. In effect, the problems with global economics, national governments, higher learning, and the arts could be improved, in his mind, if the Jewish people did not exist. His term for righting the world was the final solution. His decision to eliminate the entire race of Jews caused repercussions throughout the continent of Europe. For instance, transportation networks, specifically railroads, had to be built to move people and equipment to camps near villages that would eventually become forever linked with the crime against humanity: Dachau, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, and Auschwitz. Infrastructure was built to support this heinous mission, a necessity considered in purely economic terms. Technology was also developed specifically to make the process more efficient. It may be argued that wars had been fought throughout the ages because of religious necessity. In this case, religious clergy, although not all, twisted doctrines to justify Hitler's decision. These religious arguments continue to be discussed, as they should be, because the moral component to justify violence must be viewed from many different perspectives. As for the ramifications of the social institutions, none was affected more than the family, ripped apart by strangers, left alone to wonder if and when they might be reunited, and, if fortunate enough to survive, how might we continue? These all plagued the memories and consciences of the survivors. Now, to support his campaign of death, Hitler hijacked the arts and built a propaganda machine that was unrivaled. Films were produced to both elevate him and his ideology while denigrating and dehumanizing people who were non-Aryan. Now, these were the days before the internet, so only select audiences were able to view these products. One such example, the film entitled Triumph of the Will, was a key product that promoted the image and message of National Socialism and set the tone for what was to come. At the same time as the Nazi propaganda machine was working at full capacity, Hollywood was releasing films and cartoons that were not as heavy-handed as their German counterparts. However, the tone of these messages were eerily similar.
Stop where you are. Leave plane immediately, or girl will be released.
Okay, little man, you win.
And that racist depictions of Japanese, Germans, and Italians were used to stimulate distrust of, or in some cases, just mock these groups of people. Was there any direct result of this propaganda? Well, roughly 90 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt issued an executive order authorizing the establishment of the War Relocation Authority to the United States Army. Soon thereafter, another executive order, number 9066, was issued that would lead to the internment of over 120,000 Japanese Americans. It is clear that this was not a purely political decision, but was reached with the influence of other cultural factors. Once the order was published, the citizens were to report to the relocation centers with only the belongings they could carry. Their personal property, businesses, and real estate holdings, numbering into the hundreds of thousands of acres, were essentially confiscated and sold or given away. The case was a little different in the state of Hawaii, since most of the population was Japanese American. To put them all in a camp would be both impractical and detrimental to the economy of the state. Thus, it was decided that the Hawaii-based Japanese Americans were to be placed on a type of house arrest or martial law instead. Thus, it is fairly obvious to conclude that an economic influence was surely a factor in both situations, placing a disadvantage on the Japanese American citizens. They were also forbidden from carrying any personal artifacts other than clothing and cooking utensils, so they could not carry religious icons or even photographs, so that they might practice their personal religion. Also, since they were forbidden from carrying books, their sacred texts were also lost, except for what they could carry in their collective memory. One notable difference between Nazi and American captors, besides the obvious practice of genocide, was that the Japanese Americans were transported and placed in camps as family units. While this was not a perfect condition, it was one in which there might be a semblance of humanity imposed. This may also be a factor in how, upon their release, they were able to resume life, displaced and destitute that they were. It must also be mentioned that in spite of the ill treatment, over 17,000 Japanese Americans volunteered to fight for the United States in World War II. In fact, the most highly decorated combat unit in the entire history of the United States was the 442 Infantry Regiment. In all, while fighting in Germany, Italy, and France, this unit, made up of entirely Japanese American soldiers and led by a handful of Caucasian officers, earned a total of 15 Congressional Medals of Honor, the highest award given for valor. Now, throughout this presentation, you, the viewer, may have been provoked to add illustrations of other institutions, make category connections that may not have been raised in the video, and even argued for or against a point that was raised. If all or any of that occurred, then you have experienced the satisfaction of employing the cultural approach. While these two case studies are sobering in their content, they are still not without relevance today. Now, take a moment to write a few questions that you want to pursue answers for in any or all of the cultural approach categories. For instance, did you know that origami was practiced in the internment camps using only materials such as cigarette wrappers and the imagination? Is Or should medical data be used today that was gathered from Nazi human experiments? Or what value can be placed on prison labor? If upon finding these answers they raise more questions, then you have succeeded in applying this valuable approach.